Today, I'm going to speak about removing the fossil fuel industry's influence on politics and parliament, which frankly is no small task, but it's a vital one if we're to have climate policies that are based on science and if we are to rebuild our trust in democracy. We know that coal and gas are the leading causes of the climate crisis, but since being in government, this Labor government has approved 5 coal mines. These approvals will create almost 150 million tonnes of carbon emissions combined. And as Anate Tong said, nothing has changed. 2 weeks ago, the release of Australia's quarterly emissions data confirmed that we are not on track to meet even Labor's inadequate emissions reduction target of 43% by 2030. In fact, emissions under the current government have risen by 3.6 million tonnes last year. And yesterday's State of the Global Climate Report that we're seeing in the news this morning confirms that 2023 was the hottest year on record by a clear margin, with records being broken for ocean heat, sea level rise, Antarctic sea ice loss and glacier retreat. We know that we are in the critical decade for climate action. In fact, as Christine will remind me, that was last decade. We're now in the really, really critical decade for climate action. And importantly, this could be one of the most significant fortnights in the life of this parliament. Instead of strengthening environmental laws like they promised in the last election campaign, Labor is seeking every opportunity to work with Peter Dutton to weaken environmental laws and to fast-track new offshore petroleum and gas mines at the bidding of Santos and other fossil fuel giants. They're doing so in the middle of a climate crisis and they're ignoring the voices of traditional owners. The Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Bill was introduced by the Resources Minister, Minister King, in February, and it's largely about uncontroversial work safety issues, but it sneaks in a schedule with an extremely problematic proposal. Part 2 of Schedule 2 would mean that any action that's approved under the offshore petroleum regime, including any environmental management plan, is taken to be within scope of the original EPBC accreditation. So no matter what changes might be proposed, there's no need for that massive offshore gas company to go back and seek fresh environmental accreditation because the offshore gas environmental management regime is taken to be accredited, deemed to be okay forevermore. So this is in effect a total carve-out of offshore oil and gas from our federal environmental law framework, and it gives the Resources Minister the power to be the sole arbiter of environmental management. Now, I am an environmental lawyer and that sends shivers down my spine, but it's the sneakiness with which it's being done that should also ring alarm bells. This schedule is being tacked on to a largely unrelated bill. It's almost like Labor knows how unpopular that proposal would be if the public really knew that's what they were doing. So they attach it to some unrelated bill and make it sound really nebulous and a bit unclear. Thankfully, we worked out what it does. But this isn't the first time this has happened. The plan to only marginally increase the tax paid by massive gas corporations in the weakest possible reform to the petroleum resources rent tax was tacked onto a bill addressing the scandalous behaviour of consultants PwC, 2 distinctly different issues. Labor are clearly attempting to disguise their flagrant boosting for the fossil fuel sector, and they're also seeking to work with the climate-denying Liberals to help them pass these laws, rather than working with the Greens and the crossbench for strong climate action. So why is this happening? Why is our government doing sneaky favours for the gas industry and approving new coal mines and gas wells in a climate crisis? And at a time when more and more Australians are saying and voting for no new coal and gas, and at a time when our Pacific neighbours continue to urge us, as does the international science community, to stop approving new coal and gas projects. We know that gas is as dirty as coal and that the pollution from gas corporations is rising, putting a safe climate further and further out of reach. The last thing we need is a backdoor loophole for gas giants like Santos, who frankly are pretty cranky that the government worked with the Greens on the safeguard mechanism to make it harder for them to open new gas, and who actually wrote a letter to Resources Minister Madeleine King, urging her to bypass First Nations consultation and bypass existing environmental laws to fast-track this new gas. And hey presto, the government tacks on a schedule to do exactly what Santos asks for. The gas industry also asked for a loophole in the Sea Dumping Act to falsely legitimise carbon capture and storage as a commercially viable and effective climate solution. We all know that's absolute crap. And unfortunately, the two big parties ganged up to ram that through the parliament. I'm starting to see a bit of a pattern here. Our governments, sadly, no matter which flavour they are captured by the fossil fuel industry. The major parties are so hooked on fossil fuel money that they govern in the interests of their donors and not in the public interest, certainly not in the climate's interest. In the last financial year, the Labor Party received donations of over $110,000 from Santos and almost $85,000 from the Minerals Council, just to name a few, and I could go on, but time is tight. And we all know that coal, oil and gas corporations don't donate out of the goodness of their heart. They don't donate hundreds of thousands of dollars because they like democracy. They do it because they want approval for their climate-wrecking projects, and they get those approvals. They are buying outcomes. And the sad reality is that our government is cheap. Fossil fuel companies donate a few $100,000 and they get those billions of fossil fuel subsidies that Anna Tong referred to. They get over $10 billion of taxpayer money in subsidies every year to turbocharge their polluting climate-wrecking projects. The current system is one of legalised bribery. Money should not be able to buy outcomes or government contracts or development approvals or political access or influence. And that shouldn't be a controversial statement. It's common sense. But, and I might add, it's also a commonly held opinion in the community. And I think it was the Australia Institute polling last year that found that 74% of Australians support banning political donations from organisations that are getting government contracts, including 80% of coalition voters and 70% of Labor voters. Unfortunately, that view is not shared by the larger parties, as they would not back a private member's bill that I introduced to stop that dodgy conduct. I introduced the Fairer Contracts and Grants Bill last year to stop corporations who are making political donations from putting their hands out for public money within a 12-month window before and after of seeking either a contract or a grant or an environmental approval. Now, obviously the Greens have pushed for far stronger laws in the past, but I thought this one would be the lowest common denominator option that surely the two big parties would see the sense of. Well, unfortunately, I still couldn't get agreement from the two big parties on the basic principle that decisions regarding the allocation of government money should be guided by the public interest rather than by the interests of who's just donated to their political party. This is despite the obvious statement, obvious to probably most of us in the room, that donations to political parties should not be able to buy government contracts or government grants, and nor should they be able to buy environmental approvals. And yet this happens time and time again. Adani, remember, wanting to build that mega coal mine in my home state of Queensland, Adani and its subsidiaries donated $250,000 to the coalition in the same year that it received its final environmental approval for its mega coal mine, and including $100,000 of that was received in the month after the approval was given. So it's a please, here's our down payment, gee, thanks very much situation. This level of undue influence is really dangerous for our democracy, and it's crippling for our climate. At the bare minimum, we need to stop those with wads of dough gaining unequal access to government. But it's not just donations that talk, it's who knows who and what overpaid job is on offer. The revolving door between Parliament and the fossil fuel sector is just another way that large companies are having a disproportionate influence on our democracy. Every single resources minister in the Coalition and Labor governments since 2001, every single one has gone on to work in the fossil fuel sector. Ian Macfarlane was the Liberal Minister for Industry and Resources in the Howard and Abbott governments. Immediately after retiring, he went to the Queensland Resources Council, where he's the CEO. That was, of course, in breach of the Ministerial Code of Conduct, which has an 18-month cooling-off period and is ignored by everybody. Gary Gray was the Labor Resources Minister in 2013, and he's now the General Manager of External Affairs of Mineral Resources. Martin Ferguson was the Labor Resources Minister from 2007 to 2013, and just 6 months after that, he was the chairman of what's used to be called APPIA, the National Oil and Gas Lobby. And no one would forget former Prime Minister Scott Morrison appointing his gas industry mates to the National COVID Commission without requiring them to declare their conflicts of interest. And then, surprise, surprise, we had a recommendation for a gas-led recovery, which directly benefited the gas industry and not many others. There are too many loopholes permitting big business and big polluters to have undue and unfair influence on government decisions. One of the ways to close some of those loopholes is to strengthen the lobbying code of conduct by including in-house lobbyists, making ministers' diaries public and enforcing that cooling off period in that ministerial standard. But another way that we could restore integrity would be to get dirty money out of politics. It's been Greens' policies for decades to ban political donations from fossil fuel companies and other harmful industries, just like it was Greens' proposal for a federal corruption watchdog 11 years before that happened. And the carbon price happened because the Greens were in balance of power. And we are aiming for balance of power after the next election in both houses of federal parliament. And so in hope, I've reintroduced our Banning Dirty Donations bill. And I've also insisted that banning fossil fuel donations be part of the joint Greens crossbench offering on electoral reform. Thank you for dinging, I'm almost done. We need this because fossil fuel donations continue to cloud the judgment of whomever is in government, despite agreeing with the Greens on a safeguard mechanism that would stop about half of the 117 proposed coal and gas projects in the pipeline. The government keeps on approving them and it keeps on giving public money to these climate-destroying projects like the Beetaloo Basin and Scarborough. These threats from the mining sector only work because the major parties are scared of the ad campaigns and they are reliant on these dirty donations from the big polluters to refund their election campaigns. The last election was meant to be the integrity election. We saw the lowest vote share for the big parties that we've ever had in 75 years. We've now got a more diverse parliament. Greens in the balance of power can get results for the climate and for the community. It's time to restore that trust and integrity in our politics, and we can do this with political financing reforms that remove the fossil fuels' corrosive influence on our democracy. We can do this by levelling access to politicians and putting more transparency and accountability into political processes. More and more of Australians and our Pacific neighbours are calling for an end to government decisions that fast-track coal and gas industry profits at the expense of the climate, biodiversity and our democracy. So removing the fossil fuel industry's influence on politics and parliament is how we change the story and restore trust in government decisions. And the Greens, as always, stand ready to get it done.
Authorised by L. Waters, Australian Greens, Canberra.